Greetings, brethren. This is Alexander Sashavevich talking to you on this very occasion of the night to be much observed. Every night to be much observed, I've made a custom that before we partake of the meal, that is always very delicious, that I would read from the Bible the passage pertaining to that very night to remind us why do we keep that night to be much observed. Now for this year, 2018, I would just love to share with you something else that is very important, something that has baffled me for years because I didn't really understand why do people get confused about the Passover 14th and the night to be much observed the 15th of Abib. Now people get confused because they don't know much of the Jewish history, and they get confused because they think that the Jewish Passover, so-called Passover Jewish Seder supper, is actually the Passover, which is not, because Christ followers, they keep the New Testament Passover. Now we need to understand that prior to his death, Jesus Christ couldn't keep what today is termed the Seder supper. It's a Jewish observance known today as Passover. They call it Passover, but it's not really the Passover. Now the house of Judah keeps its Seder supper on the night to be much observed, and they again call it wrongly the Passover. Now Seder supper is observed by the Jews in the night part of Abib the 15th. In Exodus it is called the night to be much observed, or in some non-English translations, like in Serbian, it is called the night of the Lord. On that very night, night to be much observed of Abib 15th, the 12 tribes of Israel, brethren, came out of Egypt in Exodus, and they came out of Egypt after being for 430 years of their staying in Egypt, being the slaves there. Now we know that Jesus Christ instituted the New Testament Passover on Abib 14th, and that was the night before the night to be much observed. Now he instituted the New Testament Passover emblems in the night part of the Abib the 14th, at the same time when the slaughtering of the Old Testament Passover lambs took place. Now Jewish people, they consider the Passover night and the day of Abib, so the Passover night, the night portion of the 14th, and the day portion of the 14th, they consider that to be the day of preparation in the past. It was the day of preparation for the great Sabbath, which is the first day of unleavened bread. And they once understood that the night to be much observed belongs to the days of unleavened bread, and that the slaughter of the Passover lambs was the day before, and it was a separate day, a separate occasion, commemorating a separate event. So they used the Passover night and the Passover day to clean any remaining parts of the leaven from their homes, and they also, that is why they named the Passover day also the Passover, and then they named the entire feast of unleavened bread the Passover. Now over the time, what they have done was that over the time the Jewish people combined those separate events of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread into one festival and named all those 8 days Passover, or Pesach as they call it. And that is why you see various individuals get puzzled about Passover. Now there is no reason for confusion when we keep in mind the several facts, when we keep in mind the following 5 facts. The first fact is that the Jews named both the Passover and the days of unleavened bread Passover. This, however, as I said, is not the case, because Passover night, when the Passover lambs were slaughtered, comes on Abib the 14th, and that's the night prior to the first day of unleavened bread. Now Passover night and the night to be much observed, when Jewish people keep their Seder supper, there are two separate nights. There are two separate nights, and also Torah, the first 5 books in the Bible, the Torah prescribes them as 2 distinct events, 2 distinct festivals. You see, in the Old Testament, the blood of the Passover lamb slaughtered in the night of Abib the 14th was sprinkled over the doorpost to commemorate the protection that Israel enjoyed when the death angel killed all the firstborn in Egypt during that same night. And the following night, the first day of unleavened bread, it was celebrated on Abib the 15th. On that very night, the Jewish people keep their present Seder supper every year. However, Abib the 15th, which is the night to be much observed, which is the first day of unleavened bread, commemorates a different event. It commemorates Exodus, the departure of Israelites from their land of bondage. The second fact that we should keep in mind, so to avoid any confusion, is that the Jews keep the Seder supper on the night to be much observed. And even though they call it the Passover, Pesach, it is not the Passover night, because the Passover night falls the night before, and the Jews celebrate the anniversary of Israel's exodus from Egypt, which occurred on Abib 15th, on this very night, the night to be much observed. The third fact is that Jesus certainly didn't keep the Seder supper before his death, because he was already dead by the night portion of Abib the 15th. He was already dead, and he was laid in the tomb just prior to the night to be much observed, which is also the first day of unleavened bread. So he instituted the New Testament Passover on the Passover night, which was on Abib the 14th, and then he was killed on the Passover day, which was Abib the 14th, so he couldn't possibly keep the Seder supper on Abib the 15th. The fourth fact that we should keep in mind is that the New Testament says that Jesus was laid in the tomb on the preparation day for the Great Sabbath. Now that Great Sabbath was the first annual God's holiday, the first day of unleavened bread, which starts on the night, in the night portion of Abib 15th, and it is called the night to be much observed, or the night of the Lord in some translations. The day before the first day of unleavened bread was the preparation day for that holiday, but it was not Friday, which is always the preparation day for the weekly Sabbath, because you see there are various wrong translations in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and they say that it was Friday, but it was not Friday. It was a preparation day for an annual Sabbath, not a weekly Sabbath, because you have annual Sabbaths, which are the God's holidays, and you have weekly Sabbath, which always comes as the seventh day of the week. So this day, it wasn't Friday, that's the wrong translation in the Gospels. That day was a preparation day for the first day of unleavened bread. So it was the Passover day, Abib the 14th, the preparation for Abib the 15th, the first day of unleavened bread, the high Sabbath. So the Jews were preparing on that preparation day for the first day of unleavened bread, which was the annual Sabbath, and that year when Jesus Christ was killed, that preparation day fell on Wednesday. So the first day of unleavened bread fell on Wednesday night that very year. So the Passover night and the night to be much observed, which is the first day of unleavened bread, they are two distinct events. And final and the fifth fact that we need to keep in mind in order to avoid all this confusion that is out there about the Passover and the days of unleavened bread is that the followers of Christ, they keep the New Testament Passover prior to the night to be much observed. But they also keep the night to be much observed as a celebration of their exodus from the spiritual Egypt, from this world. And the Jews have no concept of that spiritual meaning of these two events. What they do actually, they keep the anniversary of Exodus, the night on which Israel left Egypt, and they wrongly call it the Passover. It's not, it's the night to be much observed. The Passover comes the night before. And they call, as I said, their celebration also Seder Supper and the Passover. And over the time, since they haven't accepted Jesus Christ, they have lost the distinction between the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. We shouldn't lose that distinction, and I hope that with keeping these 5 basic facts in mind will help us not to be confused, and will continue, and that we will continue in the true understanding of God's holidays and their meaning and their symbolism.